Studios.
In Appalachia, religion runs deep in these mountains and hollers. Some call this part of the country the Bible Belt. But long before there were churches on every corner, there were men of God who rode horseback from one settlement to the next, carrying the word of God through these ridges. And some of those men became known for certain things. Some were known for their preaching. Some were known for their singing. Some were known for the churches they helped build. But one man was known for his prayers. And according to the old story, this man returned to his hometown to hold weeks of revival. But the people would not listen. Some ignored him. Some mocked him. And some went right back to the very things he had been preaching against. So frustrated, and already known throughout the mountains as a man whose prayers seemed to be answered, the preacher packed up his things, dusted off his shoes, and before he left, he did something that people in that town still talk about today. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia Podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday, and if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. Now, before we get to that town, we need to get to the man, because Robert Sawyers Sheffey did not begin as a legend. He began as a child in southwestern Virginia, born in Wythe County in 1820, to a family that had a name people already knew. The Sheffeys were not an unknown mountain family barely scraping by. They had standing, they had money, they had lawyers, doctors, judges, and men of respectability. On paper, Robert Sheffey had every reason to grow into that same kind of life. But life does not always follow the path that family lays out for you. By the time Robert was about 2 years old, both of his parents were gone. 5 boys were left without a mother and a father, and Robert, being the youngest, was hardly old enough to understand what had been taken from him. When a child loses both parents that young, the rest of his life gets rearranged by other people. Where he lives, who raises him, what is expected of him, what parts of his parents he remembers, and what parts have to be handed down through stories. Robert was sent to Abingdon, Virginia, to live with his aunt, Elizabeth Wythe. And Abingdon was not just any little stop in the mountains. Even then, it was one of the most important towns in this part of the country, a place where lawyers, merchants, churches, schools, travelers, and families with influence resided. His aunt was a woman of means, and she raised him in a comfortable home, the way a boy from his family was expected to be raised. He was clothed, he was fed, he was educated, and there was every reason to believe he would become a respectable man in the way his family understood respectability. Maybe a lawyer, maybe a doctor, maybe a Presbyterian minister with an established church, good clothes, and the kind of manners that made well-to-do people comfortable. For a while, that path was still in front of him. He attended Emory and Henry College, though only for about a year, and I think that tells us something. Some young men enjoy college life. They fit the structure. They follow the expected road. But Robert Sheffey does not seem to have been that kind of young man. There was something restless in him, something not yet pointed in the direction it would one day go. And then came to town a revival. Robert was 19 years old when he walked into a Methodist revival meeting in Abingdon. But according to the way the story has been told, he did not go there because he was searching for salvation. He did not come in heavy-hearted, ready to kneel at the altar. No, Robert Sheffey came for mischief. Maybe to laugh, maybe to interrupt, maybe just to see what kind of scene those Methodists were making. And if you grew up around church, you know that kind of person has always existed. Somebody comes in with a grin on their face, sitting in the back, thinking they are above whatever is happening in the room. But sometimes the thing you come to mock reaches you before you get away from it. Somewhere in that meeting, the words begin to speak to him. Maybe it was a sermon. Maybe it was a hymn. Maybe it was the sight of plain people praying with a kind of power that had nothing to do with education or money or family name. Whatever it was, Robert Sheffey could not shake it. He walked into that revival one way, and he walked out another. At 19 years old, Robert Sawyers Sheffey was saved, as folks around here would say. And for him, it was not something insignificant. It was not a little religious interest he added to the life he had already had. It completely changed him and the direction of his life. His family did not all welcome the change. They urged him toward the more respectable road. Stay Presbyterian. Seek formal ordination. Become, as the old accounts put it, a gentleman of the church. But Sheffey had heard something in that revival he could not unhear. He had seen plain men speak with power, and something in him wanted that more than polish. His aunt was not pleased, and eventually Robert left her home. And that was no small thing. He was stepping away from comfort, from protection, and from the future that had been imagined for him. And this became a pattern in his life. When Robert Sheffey believed God had called him somewhere, he did not seem able to stay where comfort wanted him to stay. For a time, though, the road did not come all at once. First came ordinary life. He married Elizabeth Swecker in 1844, a young woman from the Cripple Creek section, Sweckertown, of Wythe County. He farmed. He clerked in a store. He taught school out in rural communities where children did not have much in the way of formal education, and he preached when he could. Not from a grand pulpit, not with a regular appointment. He preached wherever the chance was given to him, in homes, in little churches, in clearings in the woods, in schoolhouses, among people who might go weeks or months without hearing a preacher at all. And he taught them, in a simple way people remembered, to love his sweet Jesus. That phrase stayed with people, sweet Jesus. Not a doctrine to argue over, not a title for a sermon, just the way a man talks about someone he knows and loves. For years, Sheffey lived in that in-between place, husband, farmer, teacher, clerk, lay preacher, a man with one foot in ordinary life and one foot already reaching for the road. And then his wife, Elizabeth, died. The records do not give us much about that loss. They do not tell us what the house felt like after she was gone or how long it took him to stay unsteady again. But they do show us what happened next. Robert Sheffey left, not like a man running away, more like a man who had been held in one place by a life he loved. And since now that life had changed, the road opened in front of him. So he packed what he needed onto a horse named Gideon, and he rode out into the mountains. And from that point on, the Robert Sheffey people remembered really begins to appear. Now, if you picture a circuit rider as a preacher with a regular schedule, moving from one church to the next and keeping appointments, that was not exactly Sheffey. He was less tied to buildings than he was to people. He traveled from family to family, holler to holler, wherever he felt he was needed. He would ride up to a farmhouse and ask, "Would you have a bed or a bite to eat for a servant of the Lord?" And most people did. He might stay an evening. He might stay several days. He would pray with the family, read scripture, talk with them about whatever was weighing on them. And then he might invite the neighbors in and hold a little meeting right there in the home or out in the yard if the weather was good. When he felt his work there was done, he would saddle Gideon and move on to the next. His trips could last a month or more, sometimes longer, and he never lived like a man chasing money. He had no regular salary, no comfortable parsonage, no steady church budget. He lived on what people gave him, a meal, a bed, a few dollars, a coat if he needed one, though he might give that coat away before long if he found somebody colder than himself. That was another thing people remembered. It was hard to keep Robert Sheffey dressed decently because he kept giving away what he had. A man without a coat might get Sheffey's coat. Someone without socks might get the socks right off his feet. One story says a farmer told him he would come to the revival if he only had decent trousers to wear, and Sheffey opened his saddlebag, handed him a pair of trousers, and told him he would be looking for him that night at the revival. His relatives were sometimes embarrassed by him, and you might understand why. In a family of educated men in respectable positions, Robert Sheffey was riding around the mountains in worn clothes, giving half of them away, sleeping wherever someone had a bed, and preaching to people who might not have had a church to attend. His nephew, Judge John Preston Sheffey of Marion, Virginia, later wrote about him and said that Robert was not a man of many books, but he loved the book of books. And that feels about right. It was not an insult. It was a recognition. Sheffey had chosen the kind of man he was going to be. He was not remembered because he was polished. In fact, some who knew him were pretty direct about that. One Methodist preacher said Sheffey could not preach a lick, and that when he stood to speak, he sometimes acted more like a crazy man than otherwise. And yet, that same preacher said Sheffey was wonderful in a meeting, that he could stir the people, crowd the altar, and see genuine conversions by the score. A man who could not preach a lick, filling the altar. That tells you Sheffey had something that did not come from training. People believed he had power in prayer. And if there's one image that seems to follow him everywhere, it is this. Gideon standing beside a mountain road, a worn sheepskin pulled from the saddle. Robert Sheffey laying that sheepskin on a rock or a log or the ground itself and kneeling there to pray. Just plain, direct prayer, like he was talking to someone sitting across from him. Sometimes he prayed an hour, sometimes longer, and Gideon waited. Now, Sheffey's odd ways became part of his legacy too. He stopped for things other people would have stepped over. If he saw a beetle turned on its back, he would stop and set it right. If a dog was hungry, he might give it the food he had packed for himself. One story says that during a funeral procession, he stopped the whole line because he saw tadpoles stranded in a drying mud puddle. He gathered them carefully and carried them to a nearby creek. The mourners waited. Gideon waited. And when Sheffey was satisfied those tadpoles had a chance to live, the procession moved on. Some people called that peculiar. Sheffey did not seem bothered by that. Christians, he said, were supposed to be a peculiar people. And that was Sheffey. Tender toward the smallest things God made. But do not mistake tender for soft. There was one thing that made that warmth inside of him go away, and that was liquor. Not just drinking in some polite sense. I mean the hidden stills back in the mountains. The whiskey trade that ran through the hollers and families and made its money off the ruin it left behind. Sheffey had seen what it did. He had seen men lost to it, homes broken by it, wives and children living under the shadow of it. So when Robert Sheffey prayed against the distillery, people listened, or at least they learned to. Because according to the stories written down by ministers who knew him, when Sheffey prayed against a still, things happened. There is one old story about 3 stills. 3 different operations running in the same general area, tucked back into the mountains where the law did not always reach, and the men who ran them figured what happened back there was their own business. Sheffey had been preaching nearby. He had seen what the whiskey was doing, and before he left, he stopped above the hollow, laid out that sheepskin, got on his knees, and prayed over all 3 stills. The first one caught fire. Nobody could explain it with certainty. No lightning strike anyone remembered. No accident anyone admitted to. It simply burned not long after Sheffey had prayed over it. The second still met a different end. Sheffey had prayed, specifically, that a tree would fall on it, and according to the story, there was not any large trees close enough to make that seem likely. But a storm came brewing, and when it passed, the largest tree in the area came down directly on that still and smashed it to pieces. And then there was the third still. It didn't end with fire or a tree falling on it. The man who ran it died, suddenly, without warning. Now I want to be clear. These are the kind of stories where history and folklore get tangled together. So, I cannot tell you that every detail can be proved like a court record, but I can tell you this. People told those stories. They wrote them down, and the men running stills in the mountains took them seriously enough that some of them left the country rather than wait for Sheffey to pray over their own operation. That is not nothing. A man who can make moonshiners pack up without raising his voice, without carrying a weapon, without bringing the law, just by getting down on his knees, is a man these mountains were not going to forget. And then there was the man with the gun. Word got back to one distiller that Sheffey had prayed his business out of existence. Instead of leaving, that man decided he would handle the preacher himself. He stood in the road with a gun and waited for Gideon's hooves. When Sheffey came along, the man stepped out and said he was going to kill him. Sheffey looked at him from the saddle and said, "Suppose I ask the Lord to strike you dead." The man dropped the gun and ran, and Robert Sheffey rode on. That is the kind of story that made his name travel ahead of him. As they say, your name and your reputation precedes you. By the time Sheffey had spent years riding through southwestern Virginia, and also what is now southern West Virginia, he had become more than a preacher passing through. He was part of the religious life of these mountains. Camp meetings, farmhouses, brush arbors, sick rooms, and revival grounds all carried his memory. You heard me say brush arbor. A brush arbor is a temporary, open-sided outdoor shelter constructed of vertical poles driven into the ground, topped with horizontal branches, and a roof of fresh brush, leaves, or hay. It was used in the South as a gathering place for communal worship, revivals, and camps. And one place in particular became directly tied to Sheffey, the old Wabash camp meeting in Giles County, Virginia. Families came there for days, sometimes weeks, to worship, sing, pray, visit, and live for a little while in that old camp meeting world. Sheffey was part of that place for years, so much so that after fire destroyed the old grounds and the meeting was later reborn, it was named in his honor. The Robert Sheffey Memorial Camp Meeting is still remembered today. That's significant because camp meetings were never just background in Sheffey's lives. They were at the forefront, where his gifts made sense. A man who prayed in a plain, conversational way could reach people who did not relate to fine preaching. Under those open-air sheds, surrounded by families who had come in from miles around, Sheffey became the kind of preacher people talked about on the way home and then kept talking about for years later. But our story is not really about the camp meeting. It's about another place. A place that for a while looked like it was going to become something. By the late 19th century, this town was not some quiet little settlement where nothing much happened. It was loud, busy, full of industry, and money and men looking for work. Iron helped build it. Quarries and furnaces brought people in. Then came carbide. Then the railroad, tying the town to the outside world and letting what was made there move far beyond these mountains. And at its peak, the town had hotels, an opera house, a rail station, factories, and furnaces. Think about what that would have meant in this part of the mountains. A place that once may have been quiet suddenly had trains moving through, wagons hauling cargo, men coming in for work, merchants setting up to serve them, and families beginning to believe there might be a future there that did not depend on a rocky hillside and a hard season. For a while, it must have felt like the outside world had finally found its way into this part of Appalachia. Workers, speculators, merchants, families, and all the energy that comes when a mountain place starts booming. But prosperity always has a shadowy side. When money comes into a small Appalachian town, trouble often comes with it. Men with wages in their pockets and long hours behind them found ways to fill the nights. Saloons did business. Fighting became common enough that people stopped being shocked by it. Other places opened along the edges of town. The kind, respectable people did not talk about too plainly. In the language of the time, it was a town that had gotten above itself. And into that town came Robert Sawyers Sheffey, not as a stranger, as one of their own. After years of riding the mountains, praying over families, preaching in hollows, and facing down sin wherever he believed he found it, the road brought him back to the place where his own story had begun. He came to hold a revival, and he preached. For days, and according to the old story, he stood before the people and called them to repentance. He pleaded, he warned, he prayed, he did what he had done in communities all across these mountains. But this time, the people did not come the way the others had. Some ignored him, some mocked him, some went right back to the saloons, the fighting, the drinking, and the life he had been preaching against. And I think that is the part that must have cut the deepest. Robert Sheffey had been rejected before. Any preacher who rides long enough will be. He had faced rough men, hard country, bad weather, hunger, and danger. But this was different. This was his home. And home has a way of cutting deeper than any strange place ever could. A stranger can reject you, and you can ride on. A rough crowd in a faraway holler can laugh at you, and by morning you can be over the next ridge. But when it's your own people, when it is the place tied to your first breath, and the roads that knew your family name, That kind of rejection settles somewhere lower. These were his people, and they did not want what he had come to give them. When the revival ended, and it was clear nothing was going to change, Sheffey packed his things and prepared to leave. And before he rode out, according to the tradition that had been passed down in that community, he did something old and biblical. He dusted off his shoes, and then, the story says, he spoke words over that town. Some versions say he declared that it would never amount to anything. One version says it even plainer, that the town would never amount to a darn thing. Or others say that he condemned it to hell. And then Robert Sheffey rode away and never came back. Now here's where this story gets complicated, because what happened after that can be told in one of two ways. One way is history. The other way is folklore. And in Appalachia, those two things have a habit of walking the same road for a while. Historically, the town kept going for years. Industry did not collapse overnight. The furnace kept working. The carbide plant brought jobs. Later, mining kept people employed. From the outside, it may have looked like the old preacher's words had not changed anything at all. But underneath, the clock was running. National Carbide closed its doors in 1966, leaving behind land, buildings, and the empty space where paychecks used to be. New Jersey Zinc held on a little longer, but it pulled out in 1981. And when it left behind more than memories. PCB contamination was later discovered, the kind of thing that poisons not just land, but possibility. By the mid-1980s, the town was down to a few hundred people, an industrial park nobody seemed to want, and the hard question so many Appalachian communities have had to face. What does a town become when the work that gave it life packs up and leaves? If you have driven through towns like this, you know the feeling. Company houses still lined along the road. Old industrial pieces sitting where nobody bothered to move them. Empty lots. Weeds growing through places that used to be full of noise. Not peaceful quiet, the other kind. The quiet that comes when a place is trying to carry what it used to be and what it is now at the same time. But the people who stayed did not just lie down and let the story end. In the mid-1980s, residents organized. They fought to keep the old industrial land from being sold off. They asked for help. They cleaned up. They tried to bring something back. And that part's important because Appalachian towns are often talked about like they are only victims of loss, when the truth is, the people who remain are often the ones fighting hardest for the future. But there was another part of the story that people remembered. The sinkholes. The ground itself had started to give way. Houses and property were swallowed or threatened. The land that industry had used for decades seemed to be collapsing beneath the people who still called it home. Some looked at it and saw geology. Some saw mining damage. Some saw the natural result of what had been taken from the earth. And some remembered Robert Sheffey. And a lot of the people you ask had a very specific answer. In 1985, on Good Friday, a group of women from the Ladies' Aid Society did something about it. Years later, during Bible reflection meetings, the story came back into the open. One woman said she believed the town's rising up started when the Ladies' Aid anointed the ground and gave the town back to God. They went to the spot on Painter's Hill because that was supposedly the place where Sheffey had turned back toward town and spoken those words. It was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the hour Christians remember Christ dying on the cross. According to one woman who said she was there, the morning had been calm, but by the time the afternoon came around, the sky had darkened. The wind came up, and it felt like they were standing inside something much older than themselves. They anointed the ground, they prayed over it, and they asked whatever had been spoken over their home would be lifted. Now, I was able to talk to a lifelong resident who has lived there for almost 90 years. When I asked them about the curse that Robert Sheffey had supposedly prayed, they said, something happened because we lost all our industry. We're not prosperous anymore. They said our families had all had to leave to find work elsewhere. And they said It just seems we can't get nothing going again, and it's not like we haven't tried. Whether you believe in it or not, that is an honest sentence. It does not demand that you believe a 19th century preacher cursed a town into decline, but it tells you the story was real to some. It gave shape to loss. It gave a name to the feeling of watching a place rise, empty out, and then watch the ground itself open beneath it. And here's the part I have held back until now. The name of this town, this Appalachian town in southwestern Virginia. The town where Robert Sheffey was born, and the town where he returned to preach a weeks-long revival years later was the town of Ivanhoe, Virginia. Ivanhoe, sitting along the New River in Wythe County, near the Carroll County line. It's still there, still carrying its history, still carrying the work that built it, the losses that changed it, and the story of a preacher who, according to tradition, rode away and left words behind. Robert Sawyers Sheffey died in 1902 in Giles County and was buried at the Wesley Chapel United Methodist Church Cemetery. Thousands came to his funeral. Thousands came to say goodbye to a man who had never had much money, never chased comfort, and never seemed to own anything he would not give away if someone else needed it more than him. At the bottom of his tombstone are words that may say more about him than any sermon ever could. And I quote, "The poor were sorry when he died." Unquote. I cannot tell you that Ivanhoe was cursed, and I cannot tell you that it was not. But what I can tell you is that Robert Sheffey was real. His ministry was real. His reputation for prayer was real. And the town that remembered him had seen enough hardship to make them wonder whether words spoken in grief and mourning could linger longer than the man who spoke them. That is the thing about Appalachia. The roots run deep here, in the land, in the families, in the faith, and in the stories passed down, whether anybody writes them down or not. And the shadows come from the things we cannot fully explain, the things that happened, the things people believed happened, and the places where those two things were so tangled together that pulling them apart might destroy the story altogether. Robert Sheffey rode these mountains for decades, leaving something behind in farmhouses, camp meetings, hollers, and revival grounds. But in one town, one little town along the New River, what he left behind became something people are still trying to understand. And Ivanhoe is still living with the story. But Ivanhoe's story does not end with empty buildings, closed plants, sinkholes, or an old preacher's warning, because the people who stayed did something about it. They organized, they prayed, they told their own history, they built community again in a place where others might have often seen loss. And that is where Jubilee comes in. In the Bible, Jubilee was about restoration. It was about release. It was about returning what had been lost and giving people a chance to begin again. And in Ivanhoe, that word became more than something read from Scripture. It became a way of answering the shadow with something good. They created Jubilee Park. They had the Jubilee celebration, a huge 4th of July gathering. Families coming home, gospel music, food, children, stories, neighbors standing together on ground that had carried both blessing and hardship. Maybe that is what makes Ivanhoe's story so powerful. Not whether every piece of the old legend can be proven, not whether every hardship can be traced back to the words spoken by a preacher on his way out of town, but the fact that a community people had written off still found a way to rise up and say, "We are still here." And maybe that is the real answer to the story. Take a place remembered by some for a curse and answer it with a blessing. Not all at once, not perfectly, but together. And in Ivanhoe, Virginia, that is exactly what they did. Take a story about words spoken over a town and meet it with songs, prayer, children, parades, and people who refused to let their home be remembered only for what it lost. Whether ironic, divine intervention, or just coincidence, every year the community of Ivanhoe still has its annual 4th of July parade, and the Jubilee celebration was originally built around the 4th of July. Now, what's significant about that in this story? Well, the birthday of Robert Sawyers Sheffey was July 4th, 1820. So, after all these years, the people of Ivanhoe, after the work left, after the buildings emptied, after the ground itself gave way, still found a way to stand together and say, we are Ivanhoe. This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia Podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling. So, after all these years, the people of Ivanhoe,